Don't worry, we are friends.
Well, maybe it also circled back to something that you mentioned at the very beginning, the kind of excessive economy of accumulation and storing stuff. Yeah. And now I think something that is often overlooked is the role that time preference plays in our overall life decisions and in our motivations. And I think that's also partly, but significantly influenced by an inflationary monetary system that these time preferences have just decreased more and more and more. And I think, especially looking at like the younger generation of social media, time preference in our actions has decreased so far that, we're not really managed to look at the bigger picture of stuff again. So do you think that we sort of have to fix time preference before we can even expect to find good solutions to fix society on a larger scale?
Yeah, I mean, if that's a question around do we need to fix the monetary system, yeah, we need to fix the monetary system, absolutely. I don't think we necessarily know exactly how to do that. I think there is a gap between, financing working capital and investment capital, and this is sort of what you're talking about, around time preference and, making sound investments and being punished economically for making bad investments, and certainly, zero interest rate environments are very bad for that. Of course, interest rates are coming back up, which is kind of interesting, but maybe now wasn't the right time to do that. For various other reasons. I mean, we don't have to get into all of that, but I do think there's something there, and I think the structure of our institutions certainly lead people into this kind of consumerist, extractive, wasteful mindset. Use something once, throw it away. Attention is sort of very fleeting right now, and a lot of that derives from from the hijacking that's happening of our nervous systems by Facebook, Meta, Google, YouTube, etc. That are really doing a lot of damage, I think, to human physiology in kind of fundamental ways. And so I think it's a mix of monetary reality and the sort of the nature of business models on the internet being focused on advertisements. I think these are all things we need to fix if we're going to come out of this. And I think collectively that there's a shared problem of ownership. How do we own corporations? How do we hold them accountable? And sort of distributing ownership more, I think, could go a long way to addressing many of these problems, right? And so there are like large labor unions, and there's this battle in tech for unions. I don't want to get into a whole debate about unions, but I'm not as interested in unions as I am in cooperatives, because I think big unions, big corporations, they're kind of just like two peas in a pod, and okay, they like to fight each other or whatever, but I'd rather see the institutional structure of the corporations themselves change towards more distributed ownership, and I think that could do a better job of representing the interests of a wider group of people and of the sort of biophysical reality around us, in order to bring us towards more sustainable operations. So yeah, we need to fix time preference. How exactly do we do that? Fix the ownership structure, fix the monetary system. This is all the stuff we're working on. Yeah.
Have you seen any visions or ideas about novel coordination mechanisms in a state-like function that have excited you so far? Like maybe Balaji's network state. I think there's another podcast that's called the Blockchain Socialist. I think. Yeah. Like personally, that. I'm super far away from socialism, but I really like their series on overthrowing the network state. Yeah. Because so far I found the idea of the network state super captivating, especially as you correctly identified, having a little bit of that mind virus of Austrian economics in me. So intuitively, that was resonating with me quite a bit, and I fundamentally disagree with many premises presented on that Blockchain Socialist podcast and their critics series. But still, overall, I think it's a great series to listen to because it, exposes you to a total opposite type of ideas.
No, I fully agree, and I think Balaji is also, suffering from that same mind virus, and a pretty good perpetuator of it. He's very infectious, so you want to wear a mask around his ideas. No, I mean I got a lot of respect for him and his writing, but I think he misses the mark on a few things, and I do think that Blockchain Socialist podcast I'm familiar with. I know Josh. I think they're doing great work, and their take on the network stake I think is also on the right track, very much so. And so I'm more likely to side with him than with Balaji and the network state idea. But I think it's really about because the network state seems very much derived from the kind of sovereign individual ideas. And again, for me,
so what precisely do you think has the sovereign individual thesis thought about wrongly, and how does that translate into the idea of the network state?
Individuals don't exist. There's no such thing as an individual. Every individual, everything you think is an individual is actually something that grew up in a community, right? I mean, you don't make it out of infancy without a mother, right? And you don't make it, into adulthood without being socialized by a peer group, by a community, by a society. All of those things are integral. And so imagining that you can somehow suddenly as an adult become a sovereign individual separate from all that other stuff, it's just like nonsense. I mean, it's like step one: assume women don't exist. Well, there's two women sitting, presumably two women sitting next to me right here. I mean, they do exist. They're very real, right? And so, like, sovereign individual is just like, it's just boy math. I mean, you know about this boy math meme? I mean, it's just like nonsense boy math. So assume women don't exist, and then assume men like emerge into the world out of Zeus's forehead, like fully formed. I guess it was actually Athena that came out of Zeus's forehead, so that is a woman. But assume men just like spring forth from the void, fully formed, strong, sovereign individuals that can just like carry the world. I mean, it's just fucking nonsense. Like, you don't have to be very intelligent to like realize that. So I think it's funny the way they kind of argue these things and tell me, oh, there's some socialist communist idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, whatever. I'm not I wouldn't call myself a socialist or a communist. I don't like to put myself in boxes. I consider myself a sustainability existentialist and internet biophysicist, and those are terms that I invented. So you don't know what they mean. So I always have the leg up, which is how I deal with things. But yeah, so I think, the sovereign individual thing, I think it's nonsense for those reasons, because it ignores the fact that as human beings, we are fundamentally community-oriented, beings, right? We're very social mammals, and so if you have a theory of political economy based first and foremost on the individual, well, then you've missed the whole thing, and you're going to create some kind of tyrannical state, right? And that's not to say individual freedoms aren't important. That's not to say we don't want to guarantee certain kinds of human rights for individuals. Of course, of course we do. But we need to be careful with how we formulate all of that, and where the theorizing comes from, and that we don't just like eliminate theorizing about kin and social relations and women and all of these sorts of things, right? I mean, there's this great line: "Who cooked Adam Smith's dinner? It's his mother." So anyway, yeah.
But do you think that there is any use in focusing on the individual as the unit of economic analysis? Because
no, that'll lead you completely astray.
Because you think that economics itself is like a nonsense field?
No. I mean, okay, if you want to talk about economics, what is the unit of economics? What is the right unit of economics? What do you think?
Probably the individual, because it's not the perfect unit, but it's the best unit we have.
No.
Because if we look at society at large, or the collective, we don't even know what we ourselves want. So if we focus on the collective, where you have many people of whom we don't know what they want, as a person who we ourselves don't know what we want, like, what's going to come out of that?
It's like saying we're going to do ecology and we're going to take of our basic unit the blade of grass. I mean, no. The basic unit, if you want to do sound economics, the basic unit is a generation, is reproduction over a generation, right? Individuals don't reproduce. I'm sorry, but you can't just take a male individual and reproduce. It requires a female. It requires reproductive organs, right? It requires two people to come. I mean, I know a lot of Austrian libertarians don't have any familiarity with sex and the act of sex, and Sorry to make such a horrible joke, but no, I think it's obvious that the individual is not the atomic unit because it can't reproduce. We're not hermaphrodites. We can't reproduce alone. And if you're not talking about reproduction, then you're not even having a serious conversation about economy.
But do you think that the inability of an individual to reproduce disqualifies it of being a suitable economic unit of analysis?
Okay, can you use it as a unit of analysis? Sure, you can use anything as a unit of analysis. Is there some value there? Sure. Is it the fundamental atomic unit of economic analysis for a sound and sustainable discipline of economics? Absolutely not. We've been doing this for 100 years, and no one has, it's not, okay, you can read Mises till the cows come home. You're not going to get a sustainable theory of economics out of that. I'm sorry. The atomic unit of economics is the generation. Right? That's the reproductive unit. If you're talking about reproducing societies, which is what economics needs to be about, if it's going to be sustainable, then you can't start with an individual. If you want to start with a pair of individuals, maybe, but even a pair of individuals isn't really sufficient, if we're talking about, reproducing entire institutions and all that. And so I think a big part of our myopia is that notion that we start from the atomic unit of the individual. And that, again, that's not to say that there isn't value to be gained by studying individuals, by using them as a unit of analysis. We can use lots of things as a unit of analysis, but should it be the fundamental one? No, I don't think so. I think that's very likely to lead you astray and to get you doing, it's boy math. It's just boy math.
I think the counter-argument to that would be that, look, it's first grade biologic reality that you cannot reproduce as an individual. Everybody knows that. Everybody's aware of that.
They do that. Apparently they don't.
Well, in 2023, it doesn't seem like some people, still know that, or at least they,
Sure.
Make up their minds that it would be possible otherwise. They're probably going to, stumble about reality sooner or later. But let's just try to think through it. So, as an individual, our most basic evolutionary desires are to survive and to procreate. So, every one of our actions we do in our lives essentially aim at these two things. So we want to survive and we want to procreate. So couldn't we argue that it stems from a deeply individualistic desire to procreate, and thus the correct unit of analysis could still be the individual, because everything else just follows from that?
Yeah, but I don't think the desire to procreate derives from the individual. It derives from it's about the society reproducing, right? It's about the genetics. It's not about just the individual reproducing, right?
But isn't that just individualism on a larger time frame?
Maybe. I do think we need to expand the spatial and time horizon that we're talking about in our unit of analysis. If you still want to call that individualism, I guess. It's not the methodological individualism of Weber and Mises, but it's a kind of, I suppose it could be a kind of individualism, but I think you to do this right, you need to study kinship, you need to study families, you need to study how they're organized in communities, you need to study patterns of behavior that emerge from that, you need to study the nature of law, the nature of institutions, the nature of money. None of these are phenomena of the individual. So what do we have to gain by calling it individual? Call it whatever the hell you want, but I don't think it's about individuals. So
Yeah, I think an interesting idea to further examine would be to look at, the thesis that there is no altruism, there's only egoism distributed among different time frames. And the game theoretically optimal egoistic step or behavior would be to act in a cooperative manner, because that is going to maximize your own utility in the long run. And I think, procreation is just another result of that. And I think also love could be another result of that, because I think everybody who's reflected deeply on life is going to somehow come to the conclusion that if you just look at yourself as an individual, you're never going to be, a complete unit. I think it's still a very useful unit to start with, but I think it's fairly obvious that you cannot fulfill the entire potential of life by yourself. So the most egoistic, the most individualistic thing you could do is to look for a partner, to procreate, to found a family, and to ensure that your genetics are going to thrive on for generations and generations. So I think your unit of analysis, the generation, is just the inevitable result of maximizing individualism.
Maybe. I think that's one way to rationalize it, and sure, there's probably some truth to that, but you could probably make the argument the other way, that being egotistical is a great strategy for cooperativism. So I think to really reason about these things, you have to include grandmas in the picture. If grandma isn't part of your picture, then I don't think you're doing a sound economics. Grandmothers are absolutely critical to raising children and to propagating ideals and knowledge and information. And if that's not part of the unit of analysis, then your unit of analysis might be compromised. So I take the point that sure, okay, the egotistical, the cooperativism could be just derived from the rational of the individual. You could take it further and say that the whole universe is just one self, and it's purely self-interested, and we're all the Brahman, and that's all fine, and I'm happy with that too. So you can spin it whichever way you want.
Yeah, I think reflecting on that last hour of examining the deep issues we have. Yeah, we could go on for another 2 if you want, because I think that's one of the greatest conversations I've ever had at a crypto conference.
Okay, great.
So kind of reflecting on that journey from looking at these problems, looking at potential novel mechanisms and the results, and arguments about the proper unit of economic analysis or societal analysis in general. Where do you think you could have gone wrong?
Where could I have gone wrong?
Well, in your general
Yeah.
thesis of
Yeah.
what's the final end goal of crypto?
This could all be wrong. I don't know. It might all be a load of shit. How do I know? Maybe
I think that's a good default assumption to have in mind.
Certainly where I'll start. This all might just be a giant turtle. There could be some great spaghetti monster in the sky. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I could take the other side of the thing and say that everything Mises wrote was right and gospel, and anything that might be against it is wrong. I probably I haven't read all of Human Action, so maybe I'm speaking out of my ass here, but I mean, yeah, I think certainly a lot of this could be wrong, but what I'm trying to do is not get trapped in what seem to be other people's ideologies, right? And just because you had smart people writing about things and they wrote big books that seem very convincing, I don't want to necessarily fall prey to that, right? And so I'll look for, okay, well, what might they be missing, or what might the bigger story here be, and and that leads me to always kind of zoom out more, right? And so I studied biophysics, right? I studied the smallest units of life and how emergent phenomena exist and where they come from and why. How is it in a universe that's always running down, that's subject to the second law of thermodynamics? How do we have systems that run up, right? And that question has motivated me since I was, a teenager, trying to understand that, and I'm still trying to understand that. And I'm trying to understand, how human societies function in that reality, and I take certain things as heuristics or as sort of axioms within that about how these emergent systems operate and what they do, and relationships between information theory and energy and things like that. It's possible all of that's wrong. It would be very interesting if all of that were wrong. I'm not sure what I'd do. I'd probably move to the mountains and meditate for a while and rethink everything. But yeah, I mean, I think the reality is I tend to be skeptical of too much confidence. And the thing I tend to try to be most confident of is that we don't really know, and that chances are people are leaving things out. And so I try to look for if you look at the discipline of economics, women are very absent. You look at sort of modern discourses. More complexities are absent, right? People going on about there's only two genders and there's only ever been two genders. Well, human gender and human sexuality is more complex than that, and there is a spectrum there, right? And we should embrace that. And there's differences, and it's the differences that are important, right? And you need to honor all that stuff. And so I think there's a lot more nuance and complexity. And if it's wrong to be nuanced and to honor complexity, well, that would certainly be interesting, but it would be a less interesting world to live in, I think. So I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer.
I think it definitely was. So maybe looking at the ever more polarization of society, do you think we are going to be able to, find out in time where we have gone wrong and correct course?
I hope so. I hope we're doing that. I mean, so New York is flooding, man. Like the crisis is here. It's all around us. I hope people wake up. And even let's talk about the climate crisis. Like everyone is so sure they know exactly what the problem is. There's too much carbon dioxide in the air. I'm not so sure. Do I believe there's a crisis? Absolutely, there's a crisis. It's all around us. Is the answer as simple as there's too much carbon in the air? I don't know. Maybe. Probably not. It's got to be more complex than that. I mean, look at how we handle the surface of the earth. Look at how many trees we cut down. Like, there's so much more complexity going on here than just everyone just wants to reduce everything to one variable, one simple atomic unit, the adult male, one simple, unit of account, the US dollar or the Bitcoin, one simple figure, the GDP, one simple cause for all of the chaos in the climate, the amount of carbon in the air. I mean, okay, probably having too much carbon in the air is causing havoc, but surely there's a lot more to the story. If anything, maybe carbon's a red herring, right? If the whole world seems to be in consensus about, this one thing, well, I might be kind of skeptical of that one thing, right? That's not to say there isn't a crisis. That's not to say there isn't climate change. But, maybe just thinking, oh, we could sell everyone carbon credits and that'll solve the problem, I'm not so sure. So, I hope we can wake up to the reality that, reality is more complex than we want to let on. And, people think, oh, society is so complex today and it was so simple in the past. Like, I think we oversimplify a lot of things today, and people were more comfortable with a lot more complexity in the past. Things were more complex in the past. Borders weren't well defined, Things were always at war. There were, hundreds or thousands of different currencies flooding through every jurisdiction. So people are able to handle that kind of greater kind of complexity, and that might be necessary to properly represent the reality that we live in. And so I think, I hope that we can start to become more comfortable with those sorts of realities and that lack of simplicity, because reality is more complex, and when you try to simplify it, you squash all this information, you create externalities, you destroy the world. So, yeah.
I mean, maybe that shielding ourselves from these really hard questions of life also stems from the increased awareness and the lower friction of, having to be exposed to all of this. If you look back a couple of 100 years, the average farmer peasant probably didn't have a whole lot of time or resources or intellectual capacity to think about all of that.
Yeah.
It wasn't even relevant to his life.
Right.
And now we see pretty much everything going on in our world.
Yeah.
We see all of these problems, which, reasonably make us worried. So yeah, I think it's kind of a protective mechanism for many people.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It might be a psychological defensive mechanism to just try to simplify in order to deal with the onslaught of information. And I think that being chronically online and the way we've structured things in that way is also probably a problem. And all of our bits go through California, right? And that kind of has some impact. It's like, imagine all of your sewage had to get shipped to California to get clean before they brought it back, to your city. It feels like that's how we structured the internet. And so everyone is like, fully, synced all the time. And that can't be good for, our nervous systems are not meant for that, right? We're meant to be structured with local stories and, being around the fire and dancing and these kinds of things. And obviously we've come a long way from that. And that's not to say, we need to like go back to some, archaic reality or something. But there is an element of that I think matters. And, we ought to be true to ourselves and who we are and how our nervous systems function. And so I think a big part of, what's in store for the future, if we're going to do this thing right, is a more localist bent, right? More localism, more local institutions. Maybe we don't need to be fully connected all the time. Maybe not everything needs to be fully liquid or maximize liquidity. Like, maybe it's okay if there's more frictions. Maybe it's okay if there's more boundaries, right? Maybe membranes are a good thing, right? And so that's and I don't know exactly how to structure all that. I'm not going to pretend I do, but I just know that people seem to want to think too simplistically, and maybe it's a defense mechanism. I think that's probably a good insight. And so what do we do about that? I don't know. We find other ways to make people comfortable with complexity. What? We flow. Yeah, you go with the flow. Yeah, like the Taoists.
I think also, that reduction of friction had more merit to it in times where we still had to care much more about the very basic means of survival. I mean, don't get me wrong, like billions of people still have to fight with these every day, but looking at, Europe and the West in general, most of us have come to a stage where we do not have to worry that frantically about having, how we're going to get dinner on the plate. So the merit of frictionlessness is decreasing, and now we might be able to lever the, advantages and potential of decentralization more.
Yeah, I think that's another really good point. Like, we needed to reduce the frictions to get us, to advance us to the point where it became appropriate to reintroduce the frictions or something like that. Thank you. I think there's probably something to that. Exactly how you start to reintroduce the frictions and do it in a way that doesn't create, new oppressive realities, I think is very tricky, right? A lot of people talk about degrowth, but then others talk about, degrowth is just more colonial mindset, right? Why should the West have gotten the opportunity to hyper grow and all this, and the rest of the world doesn't get that opportunity because we know better? It's very very paternalistic. So introducing frictions is really tricky. It's an interesting problem. It takes me back to sort of what I was talking about before with the payments graph, right? Everyone in crypto is obsessed with liquidity. Everyone just wants more liquidity, provide liquidity dealers, all this, market making, all this kind of stuff. Well, what if we stop for a minute and ask ourselves, well, is there a world, is there a structure, is there an institutional form where rather than focusing on providing liquidity, maybe we can save liquidity, right? And that's what this, sort of collaborative finance thing is about. Of course, in current institutional structures in crypto or whatever, more liquidity is good because it means, whatever, better prices for trading. It means more accessibility. All this kind of stuff seems good, and so everyone thinks, oh, well, then if you had less liquidity, necessarily bad. And that might be true under the current institutional structure, but there might be worlds where, or institutions you could set up that you don't need so much liquidity in order to succeed. And if you focus on algorithms that enable you to save liquidity, right, to do more with less, to reduce more debt with less money, right, then you start to get into a very different kind of reality where you can provide the same effect as liquidity without having to provide all the assets, and if you want to put it in sort of, economic terms, you could call it more capital efficient or whatever. But again, I think this takes us back to this transition that happened in the 16th century where we moved from a world of, a financial system focused on saving liquidity to one focused on providing it, right? Coins, metal, it's very expensive to move around. The bankers were obsessed with reducing the amount of metal movement by focusing on clearing and liquidity saving, right? And when it came time for the Genoese to finance the Spanish, it wasn't about that anymore. It was about picking up silver in Seville and delivering gold in Antwerp. And they had to move metal they did, and that was fine by them, right? And sure, they used bills of exchange to do it and all that, but it became about providing liquidity, and it's been about providing liquidity ever since. And so these crypto people running around thinking we're, re-architecting finance and changing the world by providing more liquidity for our shitcoins. I mean, I'm sorry to tell you, you're just doing the same thing as those bankers financing the Spanish, right? If you want to do something different, time to save liquidity, you need to focus on a different institutional architecture for the system. And so there's a bit of a tangent from this question of how do we reintroduce frictions? And so maybe it's not so much about showing up and saying, okay, let's introduce some frictions over here because that might be a kind of oppressive or paternalistic approach. Maybe it's about structuring the institution so that they actually benefit from focusing on reducing something or saving something, right? So it's not like, oh, you can't do this. It's more like you don't need to, or it's better. Everyone's better off if you don't. And are there other examples of that? Probably, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah.
Do you have any advice to people, no matter if they're in crypto or not, because you've managed very well to master that dance of, utilizing different concepts from different political streams or ideologies without ever falling prey to one of them and becoming an absolutist of one. So how do you personally avoid, oversimplifying thoughts, keeping the bigger picture in mind and acknowledging the complexity of stuff?
I oversimplify things all the time. It's only if someone's simplifying more than me that no, I'm kidding. But I do. I mean, it's really hard. It's something I think we're just prone to try to make sense of the world, and we do that by simplifying and building models. And I mean, that's just part of being human, and it's okay. Just don't get too infatuated with your own models. Read a lot. Don't get too obsessed with one book because there are other books. Read a lot of history. Be very critical of what you're reading. Read the facts. Try to not the thing where they put a bunch of facts together to try to tell you a story about how something is, but actually just read what's going on. Read the people that don't have something to sell you, and they're just trying to study the coins or the material history or things that happen, and just put the story together for yourself about how complex history was. It doesn't follow these simple narratives. Money certainly does not follow these simple narratives. Don't take all the great authors for granted. Really, do battle with them and think about all the things they're missing, and especially think about the context that they're writing in. Right? Everyone's writing in their own context. They have their own ideology that they're selling through their writing. You kind of got to read between the lines to see it. But there's, you get a much richer experience if you put things in context and not just as here's the Bible, this is what we believe, but actually okay, this is just one book of many books. Maybe the guy was smart. If his book is popular, probably he was wrong about a lot of things, right? Yeah.
Could you walk us through your process of, coming up with a model or a hypothesis how something in the world might or might not work?
I just read a bunch of stuff and then go for walks and think about what I read and try to make sense of it in terms of what I know. I don't know.
Do you write it down, try to write an essay piece about it, or what's your
Yeah, I mean, usually I'll think about it. I'll go for a walk. I'll try to explain it to myself in my head to make sense of what I read and see if there's a story there. I'll look for analogies. I do use a lot of analogies. Sometimes analogies will lead you astray, but sometimes they're very useful. And I don't think I'm very good yet at knowing when analogies are leading me astray. Sometimes I'll like really try to chase one down because I really like it, and I'm like, no, I'm gonna really push on this one to see if I can make it work. And I still do that with things, but then try to write. I think writing, even if you're not writing to publish, if you're just writing for yourself, writing helps you clarify your thoughts. And sometimes you don't know what you think or what you don't understand until you try to write about it. And just try to explain things, simply, to a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old or whatever. You write in simple terms and try to make things accessible. And usually you'll come up with ways to explain and you'll start to understand it yourself. Yeah. And look for the patterns. I mean, there's patterns everywhere.
Yeah, I think writing to publish can be quite useful because it sort of forces you to express it in a manner that, people from different starting points will understand what you mean. And it also forces you to adhere to a certain argumentative quality, because if you're just, delivering a shit ton of low quality arguments that might back up your stuff, it's going to be quite easy for others to tear it apart. While they might have, sufficed to convince yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. Just don't let the idea of writing to publish interfere with writing, right? If it's like, that's like pressure or stressful, like, oh no, I'm going to publish this, who's going to read it? 100 people. I mean, the worst thing is to think to yourself, 100 people have written about this topic, I have nothing new to say. I mean, that might be a worse mind virus than Austrian economics, okay? So don't let that interfere with your own writing. Because if that were the case, then no one would write anything, and then there would be nothing interesting out there. So just because 100 people or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people have written about this topic before, it doesn't mean you shouldn't, because everyone has potentially something unique to say. Just trying to understand it, explain it simply, bring your perspective, your unique background, the analogies you understand, all of that can make it more accessible to someone else. And who you never know who's going to benefit from reading your work, even if 1,000,000 other people have written about it. So I only say, don't write to publish if thinking about publishing is going to, cause anxiety. Of course, it's great to be publishing because then it forces you to, make the arguments more clearly. People can engage with the work. You get good conversations, and it compounds, right? You don't know what kind of impact you might have and what kind of discussions might come from it. Yeah. So I obviously write. I try to write a lot. I've got a blog. You can check it out. I write about money and all this stuff. ebuchman.github.io, and you can argue. You can try to argue with me there or on Twitter. Yeah.
Any other place where people should follow your work?
Twitter and my blog, primarily on Twitter. I'm at Buchmanster, Buchmanster, and my blog is linked there. And you can check out our company, Informal.systems. We've got a great blog there on some of the work we do, and we write about how our company's structured and all this sort of stuff. And then, of course, if you're interested in Cosmos, cosmos.network, and yeah.
Any last comments you would like to give to our audience?
Collaborative finance is the future, and remember that money is about payments, and think about this question of how do we reduce the most debt with the least amount of money, and that's the future of money.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for joining.
Thanks so much.
I think that was an amazing conversation,
good time.
and let's see each other around.
All right.
Yeah, that was great.